What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, and this is our fourth video in our series on the book of Revelation. So, we've been going through the book of Revelation. I've been summarizing the contents of the book and explaining them from a historicist perspective. So, we've done three videos in this series so far. In the first series, I talked about the different ways that the book of Revelation is interpreted, such as preterism or futurism or idealism or historicism, which is the view I hold to. In the second video, we talked about things about how should we understand when the book was written, the date of the book of Revelation. We talked about the structure of it, understanding the epistles and the seals and the trumpets and the vials. And then we started to go through the epistles, and then in the video we did last week, which was our third video, we finished up the epistles and we went through all of the seals. So that's really where we came up to. And summarizing what I said last week, I said that I hold the view that the epistles represent seven church ages prophetically in history, and that I believe we're currently at the end of the Sardian age and are heading toward the Philadelphian age, which I see as being contemporaneous with the millennium of Revelation 20. And then I believe the Laodicean age is actually the contemporaneous with the little season that comes after the millennium. But we talked about the lukewarmness of Laodicea, and I did say last week I see a lot of that in the American church, because there are certain Christians who think we're in the Laodicean age right now, if you hold that view of prophetic ages in the epistles. So I just wanted to point that out, and I said even though I view it slightly differently, I give credence to that view. And then when I talked about the seals last week, I talked about how I think the six seals really explain the history of the Roman Empire, first at the time of the Pax Romana, when the conquests of the Roman Empire reached their greatest extent, and then I talked about how the other seals really explained the decline of the Roman Empire through things like civil wars and the taxation and the famine and the death that came upon the empire. It talked about how it prophesied the persecutions that Christians that took place under the pagans, and it talked about the fall of paganism that happened and the massive changes that came in the Roman Empire from the time of the apostles up until about the time of Constantine. So we covered that period of about 96 AD to around 313 AD, around the reign of Constantine. And so today, as we're going to go through the trumpets, we're going to come up to the full on fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then we're going to get into the post Western Roman Empire stage where people who know their history, the Western Roman Empire collapsed under these barbarian invasions that we're going to talk about today. And then the Eastern Roman Empire lived on, but it eventually found its own scourge from the rise of Islam and the Muslims that came onto the scene. And they led to the slow decline of the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise called the Byzantine Empire. And even though the eastern half lasted for another 1,000 years under the banner of the Byzantine Empire, eventually Constantinople fell in 1453. And we're going to cover all that history today as we talk about the trumpets. So just to review before we get in, we're going to have 6 trumpets to cover today. And even before I get into that, I just want to say this is our 4th video. I'm hoping to do the vials next week, and I think we'll be able to get through all the trumpets today in about an hour. But I would like to have one more to finish it, but as I've been researching it, I really do feel like I'm going to need to explain Revelation 11 and 14, and I don't want to rush through it. So if it's going to be 2 more videos after this, it'll be 2 more. If it's 1 more, it's 1 more. We're going to see how it goes, but that's really the plan. But I have every confidence we can get through the trumpets here in about an hour, because I have only 6 to explain, so I don't think that will be a problem. But just to review, like I said, I think the structure of the book of Revelation is that you have the scroll that was described earlier in the book, and you have these 7 seals. And then when you look at, there's a lot of good graphs that depict this. Within the 7th seal are the 7 trumpets. And then within the 7th trumpet is these 7 vials, which we haven't gotten to yet. And if you Google that, you Google Book of Revelation chart or seals, trumpets, vials, you can see a lot of good pictures or graphs that depict this, and it's pretty easy to see. But before we get into explaining the trumpets, I just want to read the first 2 verses of Revelation, because we're in Revelation chapter 8, and we're going to be in Revelation chapter 9 today. And I just want to read this verse just so when I'm saying this is the structure, you kind of see where I'm getting that from. So it's not just me talking, but you're seeing where that is in Scripture. In Revelation chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, and it says, when he opened the seventh seal, there was a silence in heaven about the space of a half an hour. And then I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given the seven trumpets. And then it proceeds to explain each of these trumpets. So we're going to see that there's going to be the six that we're going to talk about today, and then obviously that seventh one is the seven vials that we'll get to. So we're going to explain 1 through 6. And just to summarize what I think these mean, and then I'll go into detail explaining them each in order consecutively. I think that the first four are really talking about the invasion of these barbarian tribes, which really cemented the destruction of the already declining Roman Empire. Like I said last week in that video, I said that the decline came through a plurality of factors. The civil wars had happened, there was political instability, it got to the point where Roman emperors were getting assassinated, and there were different factions vying for power. Groups like the Praetorian Guard would actually assassinate emperors and put in their own candidates to be emperor. There were the civil wars, and by the time we get to Constantine, like we did last week, he had to fight a civil war to finally to be the Caesar over the whole Roman Empire again. So it got to the point where things got fractured. Overtaxation. We talked about the famines. We talked about death. There were things like illness and disease and plague that came. And then there's even some things I didn't specifically talk about when I was talking about the seals. Just the extravagance, the indulgence, the sensuality, the looking for pleasure, the sexual immorality. All of that played into the Roman Empire. And there's the most famous book written on this from a historical standpoint is probably Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it's an excellent history. My only criticism would be is that Edward Gibbon did not have a very high opinion of Christianity, and he obviously was highly critical of the Christian religion. But apart from that one thing, he did an outstanding job chronicling the events that took place, which led to the destruction of the Roman Empire. So that's really where we came to. So we talked last week how all those things led to this decline, but we're going to see the invasion of these barbarian tribes like the Visigoths or the Huns or the Ostrogoths or the Vandals. Now let me say that again. I think the order we're going to talk about these is the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, and the Ostrogoths. Those, and then there were other tribes that, even though I don't think they're specifically talked about in the book of Revelation, I think we could mention them, like the Franks who conquered Gaul. That's where the name France comes from. The Saxons, there were the Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain, hence that's why Britain's been called Anglo-Saxia, right? The land of the Anglo-Saxons is Great Britain, the British Isles. That all happened in this time period. Or other groups like the Heruli, which is a tribe that later got displaced. All of these tribes came in and they conquered and they set up their own kingdom. And this really led to the division of Rome. And even when we see the prophecies about the 10 horns of the 10 kings, this is really the time in history where a lot of that comes about, even though I'm not going to get too into the weeds on that because I've talked about that in other videos. But that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And then I believe the fifth and the sixth trumpets are talking about the rise of Islam. And what we're going to see here, this is very important for us to understand this, is that God brings judgment on the West and upon the East. And we saw how the book of Revelation prophesied the conversion of the empire from paganism to professing Christianity in both the West and the East. And there's centuries of church history where this took place. And you would say, well, why is God continuing to bring judgment? Well, it's because idolatry and the use of idols and images and all of those false doctrines, which really became the medieval Roman Catholic system, or in the East, it was the Eastern Orthodox system. What we're going to see is those things came in and they never cast off their use of these sinful practices. You read the Ten Commandments, we know how it says not to make an idol of anything in heaven or upon the earth or under the earth, and it's something that God has always hated. And he doesn't just hate the depiction of other gods, the golden calf or in the Greco-Roman world, Zeus or Jupiter or Aphrodite or Athena or whatever gods. He hates all of that, but he hates, in these Christian circles, you're saying, well, we're portraying Jesus. Well, no human can ever do justice to portraying Jesus. You cannot do it without committing blasphemy. It's impossible. And Roman Catholic apologists will just die on this hill saying it's not idolatry, not idolatry. But the Bible is very, very clear that we are not supposed to worship in front of idols. We're not supposed to venerate idols and all these practices, the veneration of Mary, the veneration of the saints, the belief in purgatory, prayers for the dead, all of this stuff came into the church. And essentially, even though there's distinctions in the theology, these practices came into both the East and the West, even though there are differences over certain things theologically even today, like the Philo-K clause. Obviously the East and the West, they have different liturgical views. The West used Latin, the East used Greek. So even though there are distinctions between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy even today, we need to understand that they both use images or idols. In the East, they always say they won't use a statue, they won't pray to a statue, but they'll use an image. And if you look at the liturgy of the services, you'll see that they'll use these images. And then in the West, in Roman Catholic churches, you'll have these full-on statues or idols. And so that is really important to understand, because because these false practices were not cast out of the church until later in the book. We'll see things like the Protestant Reformation get prophesied. But until that time of Reformation, this is what happened. It led the church into a point of darkness. And therefore, God continues to bring these judgments, even though we've converted from paganism to Christianity. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So I think that lays enough foundation for me to start going through these one at a time. And I'm going to try to explain why I believe they're talking about the historical events that I believe these trumpets are talking about. So that being said, I'm going to start at verse 6 here, and I'm going to read to verse 10. And it says, "And the seven angels which had them seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And the first angel sounded, and there was followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, as it were a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of water. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. And so the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise." And I'm going to stop there. Well, let me read verse. Well, I'm going to keep going a little bit. Well, I'll read verse 13 too, yeah. "And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by the reason of the other voices of the trumpet and of the three angels which were yet to sound." So we covered these. There's these four trumpets that are blown, and we see how they say they're. I'm summarizing what was said, but a third part of the grass was burnt up, or it talks about the sea, and we see this third part again and again and again. Now, like I said at the very beginning of this entire series, there's a lot of I think the one thing that everybody agrees on is there's a lot of symbolism in the book of Revelation. And then where all the disagreements come is how you interpret it. And I feel like these trumpets are as hard to understand as anything. So I'll just reiterate one more time what I said before. If you disagree with how I'm interpreting these things, I don't have a problem with that. I think Christians can have great fellowship. I think understanding the seals and the trumpets and the vials, obviously the Holy Spirit gives enlightenment, and I obviously and proclaiming what I believe to be the truth. But I think we need to have a lot of graciousness with these, and I think for the trumpets, this applies as much as anything else. But all that being said, I think the reason why these angels, it's pretty clear they're prophesying judgment. I think that's pretty clear. The first one, fire mingled with blood. They were cast upon the earth, and the trees and the grass was burnt up. Very, very judgmental language. And then the second angel, it talked about how, a third part of the sea became blood and all the life died. And then all of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were with the lamp, and fell upon a third of the river. Now, I think that this is talking about these different tribes that invaded, and I think the reason why we're seeing this language of a third part, a third part, a third part, is because these tribes came into the empire, and none of them conquered the whole territory, but the territory of the Western Roman Empire was partitioned. Each of these tribes conquered different territories, and they ended up taking different territories for themselves. And so we see that the Visigoths are the first one we're going to talk about. I believe they're what's being prophesied in this first trumpet. And when you read it, they went into Italy, and then they actually went toward the Iberian Peninsula, toward what today is Spain and Portugal, and that's really where they ended up settling. And with this history, we need to know that the Visigoths, they had a king named Alaric, and Rome was sacked in 410, and this was a major, major event. The political center in Rome had moved away. The capital was no longer in Rome after Constantine had moved it. And over the time, the city it was always this great historic city, the center of the empire, but it wasn't the capital and it wasn't the political center as much as it had been earlier in the history of the Roman Empire. But nonetheless, it was still an extremely important symbol for the empire and for the unity for the empire. So when it was sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 AD, it's a big deal. And the Roman Empire falls in 476 AD. So we're only about 60 years here before the end of the empire. And and then we see that the next one is the Vandals. And the Vandals, they eventually, what they did was they uh, ended up crossing the Mediterranean Sea to North Africa, and they established their own kingdom in North Africa. And the city of Carthage, which was probably the most important city in North Africa, it was a pretty thriving city. Back in the day, centuries earlier, Carthage had been the capital of one of Rome's great rivals. That Carthage and Rome fought three wars called the Punic Wars. And even though Rome eventually won those wars, Carthage gave them quite a fight, especially in the Second Punic War. The general Hannibal Barca, he famously crossed the Alps with his army, including elephants, and even though most of his elephants died crossing the Alps, but he was in Spain, he crossed from Gaul into Italy, and he won a bunch of victories. And for a point there was this threat that the Carthaginians were going to conquer Rome and win the war. But even though he won a lot of victories, he didn't have enough forces to conquer the city and finally win. And eventually the tide was turned, and Scipio Africanus went and he defeated Hannibal later in the war in Africa. And then in the Third Punic War, the Romans finished the job of conquering Carthage. And all of that, and even after the conquest of Carthage, Carthage was a major city. So here we are centuries later, Carthage is still this major hub in North Africa, and it becomes the capital of this empire under the Vandals. And I think the third of these trumpets, I want to reread this again because I think it's talking about the Huns, and the Huns are probably they were probably the most deadly of all of these. And I don't want to forget to mention though that Carthage, the Vandals conquered Carthage in 439 AD, but even they also went back and sacked Rome in 455, which contributed further to this decline of the city. So we see that they got sacked by the Visigoths, and then we see that the Vandals in 455 they had their own sacking of Rome. So these are major historical events. So I think it makes sense that the book of Revelation would be talking about them. But then this third trumpet, and I'm going to read it again, talking about, I believe it's talking about the Huns, because Attila the Hun, the leader of the Huns, he's really the king that's the most well known of all of these times in history. If you take any history class on this era, he's a pretty famous figure. And he was very brutal, and it really makes sense that these prophecies of just judgment and destruction, that one of them would be referring to him. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of the waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. So we see here that the second trumpet, it had been talking about the seas and these ships that got destroyed. And it's very clear that that was being attributed to the Vandals because they were the ones who crossed the ocean into North Africa. So that mentioning of the sea really plays into the Vandals because they were the ones who did cross the sea over to North Africa. But this third trumpet we see is talking about this great star that falls. And it's very clear that it's this great judgment of God, this star wormwood. And it talks about how many men died because of the waters, because of this judgment that came. And of all of the tribes that invaded, Attila, the leader of the Huns, he was the king of the Huns. He was the most fierce and terrifying of them all. And he was very brutal. I mean, they were sacking and pillaging and raping and just killing everybody. And it's really fascinating when you read the history. Today he has the nickname the Scourge of God. At this time in history, this is in a Christian society, a professing Christian society. The people believed very strongly that he was a judgment of God. And some of them even believed that this was the apocalypse of Revelation. Because if you lived in the Western Roman Empire, Rome was the world. There was essentially, I mean, they did believe, they had enough understanding of cartography to believe that there were lands beyond Rome, but the civilized world was Rome. This was the world. And so there were Christians at this time in history who really were considering that they were the last generation. That's been pretty common through church history, that Christians have believed that they were at the very end. That's something that a lot of Christians have believed for various reasons because of the judgments that they themselves lived through. But the Christians at this time, Attila the Hun, he was the scourge of God. He was he was just a menace, and he won a lot of victories against Rome. And there's the story of how, I think it's Pope Leo, how he went out to meet him and he was able to convince Attila the Hun to not go and attack or sack the city of Rome. And there's just a lot of history, but he was called the scourge of God, and he was the most ferocious of them all. And then we come to this fourth angel, and it says the fourth angel sounded, and a third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the stars, etc., etc. And the reason why I attribute the fourth one to the Ostrogoths, because they're the last ones. And really, this takes us to the post-Western Roman Empire era, because there was this Germanic chieftain named, I wrote it down here, I think it's, oh, I can never pronounce this guy's name, Odoacer. I know that's a fun name. I'm sure there's some historian, some PhD smarter than me saying, "Oh, he just butchered this name." But yeah, Odoacer, and he's the one who deposed the last Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, and that was the end of Rome. So these tribes invaded, but then the Ostrogoths, who are they're kind of like cousins to the Visigoths. They're related. They come from a similar origin point, but they're separate tribes. They came in and they conquered Rome about 70 years later, and then you get into, this is like the 530s AD, and they established what is called Ostrogothic Italy, and they would end up fighting wars against the Eastern Roman Empire because the Emperor Justinian launched what was called Justinian's Reconquest, because he was the emperor in the East. And the biggest reason why the East survived was it was more politically stable, but also a lot of the richer provinces of the empire, both for food and for money, were in the East. So the Eastern Roman Empire survived, but Justinian wanted to reunite Rome under his banner, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And by this point in history, the West had always continued to speak Latin, but Greek is what prevailed as the language in the East. And he actually launched these invasions into Italy, what's called Justinian's conquest under Belisarius, his general, and he went in and he was able to reconquer pretty much all of Italy, and he was able to retake the city of Rome, and he also was able to reconquer North Africa and a small portion of Spain. So most of the Mediterranean was still under his. So he was partially successful in reuniting the Mediterranean under his banner, but it probably accelerated the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire because they overextended themselves through their military expeditions are always expensive, and it just had a really detrimental effect on the empire in the long run, even though in the short run it was very glorifying for the emperor to be able to say that they had accomplished these conquests. In the long run it ended up being more detrimental than helpful. But that's all the history of these four conquests. And I think that really you see in the book, you see that certain judgments talk about the West and certain ones talk about the East. And I think the next two we're going to talk about, because we talk about the rise of Islam, it really is proclaiming this judgment upon the East. And when you kind of think of it in those terms, it makes a lot of sense because we just, all the seals and the trumpets that we talked about for two videos, we're talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it converted from Christianity, but it still persisted in idolatry under the name of Christianity, and so all these judgments came upon the West. But these next two, which is prophesying centuries of history, Islam is a judgment that God raised up against the Eastern Roman Empire, because we're going to talk about this history that the Arabs conquered from. They started in Arabia and they went into North Africa and they went into Persia or Parthia, what's today is Iran, and they in the east they went all the way to India, and then they in the west they conquered North Africa and they went into Spain and they conquered Spain. And later in history, the Catholics had to reconquer it under what's called the Reconquista. That's King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella of Aragon and Castile, and they unite under Spain. These are the same monarchs that commissioned Christopher Columbus to go west. And that happened later in history, but before that, when the Arabs invaded, they conquered Spain, and it was a Muslim territory. In the city of Cordoba, excuse me, I'm just butchering my names today, but the city of Cordoba was this really center of learning in the Arab world. And it's really interesting that these Arab scholars, they were Muslims, but they were translating Greek philosophers, and there was a lot of medical treatises and scientific treatises that they were translating. And it was actually a center of learning. There was a lot of poetry in that era and art. So the city of Cordoba was actually a center of learning and culture at that time in history. And they went all the way into Gaul. And Charles Martel, king of the Franks, because the Franks conquered Gaul, it later became France. They fought this famous battle against the Moors, and they stopped the Battle of Tours. And they fought this battle, and it stopped the Arab invasions into history. So I think that the fifth file and the sixth file is talking about the rising up of the Muslim Arabs, and then the sixth vial is talking about the rise of the Turks that continued the conquest of the Eastern Roman Empire. So first under the Arabs, they're also called they're the Muslims, obviously, or the Saracens. They're the Mohammedids, the follower of Muhammad. These are all historic terms that were used at various points in history. And then and then later in history, we're going to see there's the Seljuk Turks that come up in like the 11th and 12th century, and then the Ottoman Turks come later. And those groups of Turks are the ones who push into Asia Minor and then eventually conquer Constantinople. So it took a process of centuries for the East to decline and fall just as the West did, because the East went on for another 1,000 years. And then once we get past the Trumpets, it's going to transition really back to the West, and we're going to see events like the height of the papacy in the Middle Ages, and then you get to the Reformation, and then when we get to the vials, we're going to be getting into the modern age, from like the French Revolution on into our day. But first we got to so right now we're really in the post-Western Roman Empire era. The Rome fell in 476, and then we're really talking about the Middle Ages from 476 to 1453. In that era of 1,000 years, really the Muslims, they rose up. They were a huge thorn in the side to the Byzantines, who they believed they were the second Rome. And eventually it led to their fall. And like I said, I think God brought the Muslims to be a judgment upon them because of the fact that the East never cast off their images. And when you read the history of the Byzantine Empire, there were actually groups of Christians that rose up. They were called the iconoclasts, and they opposed the use of images because they said they were unbiblical, they're sinful, they were not good. And then most of the emperors sided against the iconoclasts with the other party that supported the use of images. And a lot of the writings of the iconoclasts have been lost to history, like a lot of these other kind of proto-Protestant sects. And you read Catholic historians or Eastern Orthodox historians. There's a lot of these groups like the Albigenses, the Waldensas, and they'll say they were heretics. They'll call them Manichaean dualists, but then when you read the older Protestant writers, they say, oh, that's not true. They were Bible believers. So you get into these really interesting things about history. But the iconoclasts opposed the use of images, but the state eventually kind of persecuted them and stamped them out. And I think eventually God, as he often does, his patience runs out. And that's where we come to. But now, all that being said, so we're at the fifth trumpet here, the fifth and the sixth, and you're going to be saying, well, Joe, why do you think it's talking about the rise of Islam? So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to give some comments, and I'm going to read a section from E.B. Elliott. I've read him multiple times through this series, and that will really give explanation to why I'm thinking the way I am. So we're in Revelation chapter 9. And I said, and the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and unto him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose smoke out of the pit, and the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as scorpions of the earth, and have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was the torment of a scorpion, and he striketh the man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and he shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the shapes of locusts were like unto the horses prepared unto battle, and their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates, and it were breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots, of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had a king over them, which is an angel of the bottomless pit, whose name is in the Hebrew tongue Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue has his name Apollyon. One woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter. So there's a lot to unpack there. Before I talk about why I think this is talking about the rise of Islam, and I want to comment for a second on, like, a lot of futurist interpreters or dispensationalist interpreters, whatever name you want to use. A lot of them think that this is talking about the coming of some army of demons or aliens or some views like that. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't necessarily see it that way, but I mean, like I said, with a lot of these views, I don't have an issue with that. One view that I've heard that, even though I don't necessarily hold it, I find really intriguing, like Derek Gilbert, he's talked about how he believes the Watchers are imprisoned under the earth. And I certainly believe that. If you watch my videos on like Sheol and the Giants, the Watchers are they're that group of angels that led that pre-flood rebellion, and they were imprisoned under the earth. And Derek Gilbert, and he's not the only one. I'm just using him as an example, but he really holds the view that this is talking about the bottomless pit being opened up from Sheol, that lower compartment of Sheol, which the Bible calls the bottomless pit. And he thinks it's talking about the Watchers. For a brief season before the end of history, they get let out. And I just thought it'd be interesting to comment on that because this is such a Nephilim heavy focus channel, even though I haven't been talking about that in this series. And I think it's intriguing. I think when you read like Second Peter and Jude, it seems like it seems in my mind that the Watchers are going to stay imprisoned under there until the end. But I did want to just give a comment on it because it is an interesting it's an interesting idea to say the least. But I think we do need to remember that there's a lot of symbolism. I think this is clearly talking about a true judgment coming, but I think we do need to remember there's some very real symbolism in the books. I don't think you have to interpret this like an army of demons or aliens. I think it can just be symbolizing the coming of this army. And I think the most important attribute that's talked about here is the fact that these men are described to be like locusts. And you say, well, what connection are there between locusts and Islam? Well, we need to understand the history here, and the history is that locusts come from the wilderness. And you think even in the Bible, it's always the Sinai or Arabia, the deserts. And that's the region where the Muslims come from. They come from the biblical world, from like Israel or Egypt. Sinai and beyond into the Arabian Peninsula is that wilderness. That's where locusts come from. And I think in the minds of people for many centuries, the locust has been this symbol of that part of the world. And John the Baptist, he goes out in the wilderness and honey and locusts. It's right there. When you read about Moses being out in the wilderness, there's locusts. It's in the Bible. And even just to use a movie reference, if you've ever watched the movie Hidalgo, which is a very, very loose interpretation of this historical cowboy from the West who went over to Arabia, he's riding through the Arabian deserts, to places like Damascus and Syria, or deeper south in the Arabian Peninsula. And in the parts of the movie, there's this shower of locusts in this part of the world, and that really does happen because locusts really do live there. It's a symbol. And so it really does make sense, at least in my mind, to say that this army that is attributed to being like locusts, it can be symbolizing an army that came out of this portion of the world. And the bottomless pit, Arabia is essentially the middle of nowhere. It's really, there's still nothing there today. The discovery of oil drastically changed the importance of the Middle East from a political and an economic standpoint. But before the discovery of oil, there was nothing there. I'm not talking about further to the north, like Syria or Turkey, or to the west. You got Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula itself. There's just nothing there. And I don't mean that in a disparaging or demeaning way. That's just been the historical reality. And so I think when it's talking about the bottomless pit, it's really talking about this army essentially came out of nowhere. And obviously, there's a lot of attributes here that's described. You know, when it's talking about, they rode horses onto battle, and their heads were like the crowns of gold, and faces are like the faces of men. And they had breastplates of iron. I think that is describing a lot of the attributes of these Saracen warriors. The breastplate of iron, they're riding horses. And I think when it says that men desired death but did not get it, I think it's really talking about this was such a great judgment for the Christian world. And a lot of the Christians that were not killed, who wanted to be killed, it's saying that, they a lot of times they would be enslaved by the Muslims, or they would be a lot of Christians living under this new Arab empire. They had to pay heavy taxes to the Muslims. They were really second class citizens. There was this real submission under the rule of Islam, especially if you did not convert to Islam. And so, yeah, it was a heavy judgment, and men wanted to be out of it. And I think when it's saying those, only upon those who do not have the seal of God, I think it's really describing how God is saying, even in the midst of these historical events, he still protected his true children, which he does all throughout history. Now, obviously, going back in history and looking at the jot and tittle of all that played out, we're not back there, but that's essentially what I think it's all talking about. Now, whether I've convinced you or not, I don't know. I'm going to read a portion. I've been reading a lot from E.B. Elliott's commentary on the Book of Revelation. This is volume one of his 4-volume series. I've been reading this throughout these videos, and he really does a good job of explaining all the history behind these trumpets. So I'm going to read page 381. And then after I read this, we're going to do the 6th trumpet, and then we're going to be done. So this is what he says. He says, first and chiefly the locus, the groundwork of the symbol is peculiarly Arab, or uniquely Arab. So the sacred history of ancient times informs us it was the east wind, it says, which brought the locusts on Egypt. So they came from the east. And what's east of Egypt? It's Arabia. And then he continues, from which the inference arises that the country they issued from must have been that which in all its extent lies east of Egypt, which is Arabia. Hey, I just said that. So too in modern times is the testimony of Volney, the most judicious, as Gibbon calls him, of Syrian travelers. The inhabitants of Syria, he observes, have remarked that locusts come constantly from the deserts of Arabia. Leburon from the convent of Ramah gives the same report, and the Moorish writer Leo Africanus from the western part of North Africa, one not dissimilar to that. Besides that, the very name for locust and the similarity of the names is a thing not attended to, and as we have seen in Scripture symbols, I say the very word for locust might almost to a Hebrew ear suggest an Arab. The names of the one and of the other in pronunciation and the radicals not dissimilar of the locust are bay, and of an Arab are b, and indeed the locust simile one used in earlier scriptures, which is usual appropriateness to designate the numbers and character of an invading Arab horde. Again, as of the locust, so of the scorpion, which is another symbol that was used in Revelation 9. The native locality was by the Jews considered the Arabian desert. And I'm going to stop there. So he's saying that this symbolism of the locust here in the beginning of Revelation chapter 9, in the ears of the hearer, it's such a clearly that these animals come from Arabia, and therefore the symbolism really should, in our minds, point to this army, this horde coming out of Arabia. And then he also said that the scorpion really is the same thing. So when you look at all that symbolism, it really makes sense that it is prophesying the rise of Islam, the Muslim armies that came and they conquered such a huge portion of the world. Once again, it's a massive historical event in history, the Arab conquests. And therefore, it makes sense that these historical events would be prophesied in the book of Revelation. Now, maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't, but I will say that this was the view held by Martin Luther and John Calvin, and if I was really pressed, I could go back and find those quotes. I don't have them in front of me right now, but I've read them at multiple points in their writings that they really did believe, like many historicist interpreters throughout history, that the book of Revelation in Revelation chapter 9 is talking about the rise of Islam. Okay, we're at 42 minutes here, so I'm going to explain this last one, and then we're going to be done. So all of that history I just talked about, the Arabs, they conquered from the Arabian Peninsula. They went, north to Damascus. They went east into Persia towards India. They went to North Africa. They conquered the Holy Land around Jerusalem, which is why we get the Crusades later. And, they went to Spain. And now, so obviously the empire whose losses, the Arab advances really came at the expense of the Byzantine East. And eventually things stabilized to where the Eastern Roman Empire had Constantinople and the Balkans, and then they had Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And then there was the river of demarcation, and then on the other side you had the Arabs. And that's the way things stabilized for a decent portion of history until we get to this final vial where these the Turks, the Seljuk Turks in the 12th, the 11th century and the 12th century, and then later the Ottoman Turks finished the job, but they really cross into Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and they were the ones that really complete this conquest of history of the Eastern Roman Empire. And there was this massive battle in 1071 that you can look up called the Battle of Manzikert, and it was a disaster for the Byzantines. And this is the reason why the Byzantine emperors, they went to the Latin West, their fellow Christians. They were asking for help from the Pope, and this led to the launching of the Crusades because they needed help to survive, because they were on their territory was shrinking more and more, and they were getting pushed back to their eventual destruction, and that's what happened. So this is really what I think is being talked about in this final vial, and I think it really leads up to the final culmination. And the city of Constantinople, it had been Byzantium, hence the name Byzantines. And Constantinople had survived for a long time. It survived a lot of sieges throughout history because the walls around it were massive, and they built this massive system of fortifications, the walls around Constantinople. And it was built in a perfect place. It's built in this little peninsula right on the Bosphorus. And so it was a very, very easy area to strategically defend. But finally, the Ottoman Turks conquered the city, and that was the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. So I'm gonna, and then this is the last one. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, and saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed and were prepared an hour a day in a month to slay a third of the part of men. It's the same symbolism we saw before, interestingly. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard a number of them, and thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat upon them having breastplates of fire and jacinth and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of the mouth issued fire and smoke and brimstone. But these three were the third part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths, and from their power is in their mouth and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and had in which they did to hurt. And the rest of men were not killed by these plagues, yet repented, and now not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk. Neither they repented of their murders, nor their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. That's really important. So I just read how this army coming from the the Euphrates region, so from the Arab lands into the Byzantine lands, is this army is bringing judgment. And what does the Bible say? Despite the judgments that's coming, the Christians, or the professing Christians, however you want to say it, did they repent of their idolatry and their worshiping of devils and idols, or their idols of silver and gold and wood and brass and all that? No, they don't. So when I'm saying this is a judgment that God brought against the Christian world, that's not arbitrary. I think that really reinforces the point. Now, people can debate me about the specific historicity if they want to, and that's fine. I've said that multiple times. But I think there's really good reason to see it this way. And if I have not convinced you to think of things along this line, I would really highly recommend a commentary like, let me pull it up here, E.B. Elliott, because he really goes into a lot more detail than I can. I've been trying to just read little snippets to give people what are probably the most relevant parts, but you can go into so much more detail on this. And this is really what I said in video one. To understand the historicist method, you really do need to understand history. And I know some people don't like that because they don't like history, but that's what Bible prophecy is. And so if we're really saying that this book has been fulfilled gradually over the centuries, you would need to understand the history throughout the centuries to understand the method. And I think other methods like the idealist method, they just don't require that. And I think I know I've kind of picked on the idealists a little bit in the series, and I'm not trying to, but I think that view, because everything is so symbolic, there's no literal application. They don't have to worry about making any wrong predictions about interpretation, because as everything is just so general, they don't have to worry about that. But I don't really think that means it's right. I think that's just it's a safe view. And like I said, some of the futurists, even if I don't always see it eye to eye, I can respect the fact that they are kind of looking at it through a historical lens of seeing it being fulfilled by literal events, and I can respect that. I really can. Even the preterists, even though they think it's all in the past, at least it's real history. And so, like I said, I mean, this requires prayer and discernment and study. So don't take my word for it, guys. I say that with a lot of topics. Do your own thinking, do your own research, come to your own conclusions. Critical thinking is a good thing. I hope this series has been helpful so far. We're going to wrap it up here. This has been the Trumpets. In the next one, we're going to get into things like the church in the wilderness, the two witnesses, coming up into the Reformation era, and then we're going to go forward into the vials, which really takes us into the modern age. Things like the French Revolution and the rise of the modern world. And we're going to see the decline and fall of the papal antichrist system. So all that is really interesting stuff. So Hey, let me know what you think about this series. Let me know how you view the book of Revelation. Feel free to comment below. Let me know. I love to hear your feedback. All that being said, this is Joe Harper of Reformed Truth Ministries. God bless everybody. If you want to see more videos like these, then please consider supporting the work of Reformed Truther Ministries. Contact information and donations is available at www.reformedtruther.com.